Well, hey everybody. Kristen and I are here. It's Peter. Excited to share with you today, have a great discussion today, continue in this discussion on rituals that we've been having. I think we mentioned this last time, but if you've been following along, we did make an update the last couple weeks around EastLake and wrapping up 2023. So if you missed that update, we'd encourage you to go back and to watch that. We did a rituals discussion a couple weeks ago now on aging and on celebrating birthdays and that whole concept. Today we get to talk about grief, but I want to kind of rewind a little bit to kind of go back through this year, because really this year has been a year where we've been focusing on rituals. It was kind of the theme for our year. We've been going through Sasha Sagan's book for small creatures such as we, but we kind of rewound it, and we were discussing earlier just all the different rituals that we've discussed. We started the year with Kent. He kind of did this awesome discussion, the idea of just an intro to rituals. What is a ritual and how does it serve us? What does it do to help us? It connects us to this broader group, helps bring meaning to our life. And then Kristen, you interviewed Benji, kind of some discussion on Christian rituals and which of those still kind of apply, which of those still have meaning, and which of those still kind of make sense given some evolution in our worldview, and maybe some, like, an outfit that you used to wear and you used to love, and maybe you don't like some aspects of it anymore, but you still like some parts of it. So that was a great discussion.
I
We
love
did
that one.
discussions. I know we
I
did some
love
great discussions on springtime and Easter. Kristen led a discussion on fertility. We
hmm
did a discussion. We had two ones. One was on spring and one was on summer. So we kind of went through on some of that stuff. We interviewed Sarah and Brittany talking about mental health rituals. And then last time we talked about aging. Today, we're wrapping our discussion on rituals. This is one of our last recordings. We have a couple more on the year that we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is kind of our wrap up when it comes to Sasha's book and just the idea of rituals. And today we're going to talk about grief. So looking back on the year, did I miss anything when it comes to rituals? Comes to your brain, or anything that I missed there?
No, I think overall for me, that book and these discussions, I think I'm really thankful for them because they've just taught me to be more aware of my
Mm-hmm.
everyday life and what a gift it is. And that's what we've been saying at Eastlake. Life is a gift. Love is
Yeah.
the point. And I think these discussions just reminded me to mark those things, to be aware of the gifts, to
Mm-hmm.
not get so quickly moving through my days and my life that I miss it. And I think there's
Yeah.
a danger in that. And so these are just these discussions, and implementing some of these rituals have helped me just remember to mark where I'm at
Yeah.
in my life and in this world. And I'm thankful for that.
Yeah. I was ditto to that. I was thinking too, for like the last, I mean, for until Eastlake, until the last couple years, where a lot of my perspective has shifted, Christianity facilitated almost all of my meaning making, right? So like there was like when it's springtime, when it's Easter, when it's Christmas, when there's a child, when there's, like all of the different rituals were kind of just, my hand was held for me, to be able to like kind of make sense and to bring meaning and significance to my experience. And kind of transitioning out of Christianity as my primary worldview, I really appreciated this book to help remind me that Christianity can bring lots of meaning, but there's plenty of meaning making out there that like
Yeah.
Christianity doesn't own all of the meaning making on the planet. But that you have to kind of be intentional, right? And I think it's brought up that I was having that facilitated for me, and I wasn't driving most of it. I was kind of just in the lazy river, getting pushed down by the current. And I've been challenged through this book and through kind of her perspective, because I think it's reminded me like, ooh, I need to be intentional with that, because it can be easy just to get lost in your algorithm or follow the cadence of whatever society says. And if you aren't intentional with bringing about rituals and making time for meaning making intentionality, you can kind of just be on autopilot and not kind of fully be awake, feels like. So
Yeah.
I've appreciated the year. I think it's been challenging.
Me too.
Yeah. Today we're talking grief. I made the joke a minute ago that these calls feel recently just like we spent an hour crying together, and I don't think today's going to be any different. Last
I'm
week,
already I'm
I know,
already
last week
there.
we were discussing what should we talk about when it comes to grief and rituals around grief, and obviously there's just an important human ritual of grieving loss. Grieving is an important aspect of being human. But then when you layer in, I think some of the EastLake, the shifting of this chapter, right, the wrapping up of EastLake, there's additional layers when it comes to grief. And so last week was a little bit teary in all of my prep, listening to different pieces of content related to grief. There were tears, and there's probably going to be some tears on this call too, which is okay. But it'll be interesting to see how today goes.
Yeah.
In starting the conversation on grief, where do you want to start?
Well, I think both of us went back and looked at, I still have people who have reached out to me about a message that I did about grief years and years ago. And I couldn't find that video from Eastlake, but I did have my notes. So I was going back through. And then last year, we did a 3-week series on grief, facilitated by Sarah Hansen. And I think I would just like to say to people, those are probably worth re-listening to if you find yourself in a season of grief. I think those are really helpful. I'm not sure how much of what we talk about today is going to be helpful or just you and I processing out loud.
Yeah.
And maybe that is helpful to some people. But I think one of the things that we all have mentioned in our conversations about grief is that there's very different elements to loss there. And as I was reading my message, I started by saying loss is not just the loss of a person. It's not just the death of a human, but it's the loss of, you grieve the loss of anything, any relationship, any season in your life. When it ends, there will most likely be grief. And I think my perspective on grief has come from mostly my experience of losing my nephew, which if you've been around Eastlake at all, I think you probably heard me talk about. If you haven't, just know that shapes what I'm going to say today, that we lost my nephew when he was 3. And most of my grief lessons I learned through that process, but I feel like today is different for me, and that I'm talking about the loss of a season. And so I've just been sitting with that today and this last week as you and I have talked. Even this morning, I walked my kids to the bus stop and came back. And I had my coffee and I was like, okay, I still have some time before I get on with Peter. And then I checked the news for a few minutes, and then I was scrolling through Instagram, and there was a Seattle Mariners post, and it was like one of our favorite fans was able to stop by again. And it was this boy who survived cancer. And there were pictures of him with like Julio Rodriguez and the team. And I was sitting at my kitchen table just, an hour ago. And I was just in tears because I'm like, gosh, so thankful that boy survived.
Yeah.
And I'm so sad that ours didn't. And I think that to me is just what grief looks like. It's just there. When you lose something, it's always there. And it's just a thing that we have to learn how to hold as humans. It's just part of our experience.
Yeah. In re-listening to that series, Sarah's series, which thank you, Sarah. I teared up a number of times in kind of revisiting some of the stuff she shared and Sarah Nystrom shared. But a big theme was just ultimately grief is always associated with endings, right? And it can be the ending of a life, right? A loved one. It can be the ending of a chapter. It can be the ending of an expectation or a dream, right? Like I wanted something to happen. I wanted this relationship to go somewhere. I wanted this career to go somewhere. And the ending of that creates this sense of loss, right? Grief is always obviously connected to loss. And I was thinking too about even Eastlake, like for people that love Eastlake or have been around in the community and that would say they love the idea that life is a gift and love is the point, right? If you have that written down in a journal somewhere, or that's like an idea that has resonated with you at all, that love is the point at some level to experience love, then you need to like learn how to grieve basically, because there's no way. So it's like the opposite, right? It's the yin yang. It is the opposite side of the love. If you love deeply, you will unfortunately be required to become an expert at grieving. Um, it's the price you pay for loving, basically. That's the cost of loving deeply. And I think whether that is just feels sad or feels like something that is um, maybe it's our culture, or it's just a human thing of that avoidance, like not wanting to. I know tend to be a positive person, so folks, the glass half full, right? Type of personality. I think more often than not, it can be something that we're not taught. It's not like I mean, often we're taught growing. I mean, at least maybe for me, maybe this is privilege and not having experienced a lot of loss until you age a little bit, but um, I think maybe that's even going back to the aging discussion. Part of the challenge of aging is is recognizing that there's a lot more loss in life than you were planning on. At least if you had it pretty easy growing up. So I think your experience with your nephew is a good example of just the price you pay for loving. And we're all going to be faced with opportunities to grieve, and we have to kind of learn how to do it.
Yeah, it is. It's the price you pay. Um, it makes me think of this poem that I sent you. I'd love to read it. It's by
Yeah,
Louise. I don't know how to say her last name. Erdrich.
I think it's Erdrich. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like it fits in here, so I'll read it. Life will break you. Nobody can protect you from that. And being alone won't either, for solitude will also break you with its yearning. You have to love. You have to feel. It's the reason you are here on earth. You have to risk your heart. You are here to be swallowed up. And when it happens that you are broken or betrayed or left or hurt, or death brushes too near, let yourself sit by an apple tree and listen to the apples falling all around you in heaps, wasting their sweetness. Tell yourself that you tasted as many as you could. I think that's one of the things that you and I have been talking about as we process the end
Mm-hmm.
of this season. And obviously, it's a season of gratitude, which we'll be talking about, in our next messages. We'll be more
Yeah.
focused on that. But when you love something, when you work really hard at something, when it ends, I think my hope is that the things that I love the most, when they end, that I can look back and be like, that was love. That was it.
Yeah.
And I tasted as much as I could.
Right.
Yeah.
Just wanting to, I love that poem. It reminds you to focus on how much you did your best, probably, right? Like that whole like concept of most people are doing their best, right? That's a sentence that's said around the house. Brittany says that to me whenever I sound critical of another person or myself or whatever. And um, I think that poem is a reminder of like the importance of focusing there, because when you are experiencing loss, it's easy to kind of spiral into feeling that sorrow for waste or what could have been done better, right? I was thinking about that as my kids' age, right? I have a couple of friends whose kids are a little older. One friend whose daughter's heading off to college. I know we discussed. I have a couple of friends whose kids are heading off to college, right? Kids that I was at the hospital, right? You mentioned, all
Yeah.
right? I've held this child, and now they're at whatever UW, and it's crazy to think about. And then I have a buddy that sent me a video of his kid And I was like, oh my gosh, he's a teenager now. He's not a kid. And like even like recognizing like, ooh, I'm like a year or two away from like feeling the loss of like, did I do enough in my daughter's childhood? Because she's now in
Mhm.
teenager land and childhood is over. Like, I think it could be easy to spiral into sorrow. Like, ooh, I could have, should have, maybe if I'd have done better. I think we can get kind of critical. And so, anyways, I love that poem as a reminder to be kind to ourselves and to focus on all the things that we did to do our best.
Yeah. I, those of you who were around East, like when we were meeting in person, one of my best friends in all my life is Amy Olson. And her son just went to college. That's the one that Peter was mentioning. I was saying I went to the hospital
Mm-hmm.
and like knew it was coming. I think that's an element of grief. Like
Yeah.
the anticipation of it, it's coming. Eric and Amy knew he was graduating and going to college.
Yeah.
Um, but that moment of dropping him off, I saw them last week before they did that. And we kind of joked around about how they're ready and he's ready and all of those things. But that picture, oh my gosh, I think it was last night that I don't know when it was, Sunday, that they posted, and I sat on my couch and I cried. And Andy was
Yeah.
like, "What is wrong with you?" And I'm like, "I'm already imagining 10 years from
Totally.
now when I take JB to wherever he's going or whatever he's doing in life." And that feeling, the anticipatory feeling, is really overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. When we are thinking through that, I find myself, I can't think out of Succession. Those of you that have never seen the show, spoiler alert. But there's a character in Succession who says that he's not sad about something. He says, "I've already pre-grieved that. Like I knew it was coming, and so I've pre-grieved, and so it's not gonna like I'm not impacted by it because his siblings are asking why isn't he freaking out basically, and he's like, I've already pre-grieved that." And then of course in the show, when he actually is confronted with the loss, he hadn't pre-grieved it. But I find myself relating to that, like trying to pre-grieve, like, or I want to like live out this experience. Okay, kids going off to college, or whatever you
Eastlake,
name
the wrapping of
the
Eastlake.
future thing, the wrapping of Eastlake.
Yeah.
I'm gonna feel like sad about it, and then when it gets here, I won't have to. But the older I get, the more I just feel like, oh, now I'm just feeling it twice because there's no way to avoid, right, that the tears coming when you drop your kid off, or there's no way to avoid feeling sad when we have to have this wrap up to this experience. So anyways, I think pre-grieving is a tendency I find myself trying to. It's like a way to like feel less hurt or less sorrow,
Mm.
but I kind of think it makes you just feel sorrow more. Or maybe it's just like like a not admitting that I'm feeling sad about it, and so it's like I'm through this, I'm working through this, like I'm like it's just like denial. It's the first stage of grief, right? It's like I've already dealt with this, or I've already um, I've come to accept this already. When really, that's the denial phase. Basically, you're just at the beginning.
Yeah. I think there's an unavoidable part of it if you know that something is ending. Sometimes we don't know,
Yeah,
and that grief is um, immense and has a different element to it. I think there's sometimes when you know something is ending, whether it's someone is dying or your marriage is ending or your child's going off, or this, we know that this season of our lives um, at Eastlake is wrapping up. I think you're right. You can't pre-grieve. You also can't stop yourself from anticipating it.
yeah,
It's an element of both. You can't, you have to acknowledge the reality and not sit in denial. Um, but I think what I sit with, and that's so hard, is that nothing can prepare you for the actual moment when that thing is gone.
yeah,
And I think I once you're old enough and you've experienced enough life, and when you've experienced loss, you know that feeling. It's very disorienting. The moment that something is over, that I think your body, your mind, your conscience tries to like prepare you for it. And I think that's normal. I don't know how else to
Yeah.
walk through something. But since we're talking about grief, I think that you have to be honest. There's just nothing that can prepare you for that
Yeah.
moment
Yeah.
when something is gone.
Yeah.
When the
Reminds me
reality of
of,
like something becomes a memory. That anyone who's lost a loved one, a grandparent, a parent, a child, there's um, there's there's just a stark moment when the, your spirit, your body, your humanness has to acknowledge that that person is no longer here on earth, and there's nothing that prepares you for
yeah. It reminds me of something Sarah said in their talk. The talk she presented, she talked about a quote, and essentially the summary of the quote is that grief is not a problem to be solved. You'll never triumph over grief. Like you
that.
won't, oh, I'm feeling grief, and now I got to get through this grief and accomplish this grief season, so then I can move to the next season. If you try to solve it, you'll never find relief. The key is to accept the loss, acknowledge what you're going through, and start to feel the feelings, basically, like experience
Mhm.
those feelings. That's the way to manage it. And to also recognize that once you've lost, it's going to come up at different seasons forever, right? Like once you've experienced that loss, like essentially you'll feel those feelings at different points in the future too. So to not try to get rid of those as much as to just
Mhm.
notice them and
Or have the
acknowledge that,
expectation that you're going to get rid of them.
right. Yeah.
As I talked about this morning, I'm just scrolling Instagram
Yeah.
and the Mariners come up there, and that was
Right.
not. And I think I've grieved that long enough to know that I don't have the expectation that it will never be sad.
Yeah.
I think that's a part of grief too, that um, I think we're getting better, as I will just speak, I think from an American cultural standpoint. I feel like there's been progress that's been made in terms of just, it used to be like, let's help people feel better. Let's help
Hmm.
people get over it. Let's help people
Move on.
laugh instead of cry and move
Yeah.
on. And I think there's just a better general understanding of mental health now and the processes that we go through as humans, where we're getting better at just acknowledging the only way through it is through it. And
Yeah.
um, you have to sit with those feelings, process those feelings, live with them, learn to partner with them and accept them as part of
Yeah.
your life rather than denying them or pushing them away. And I
Yeah.
think we've gotten better at that, but I think that's what we're talking about too, is this there's rituals um that, rituals become an important part of that, I think, of handling the feelings as we move through something that's sad. But for me, one of the things that I heard early on in my therapy was I was doing EMDR, which is like a therapy that deals with trauma. And I remember my therapist saying, um, sad things will always be sad. And
Mm.
there won't ever be a point where this experience is not sad. And I think that's been really helpful.
Yeah.
Um, there's things that you can do to, I guess I would just say, if anyone is listening or watching that has experienced trauma as part of their grief, that there are things that can help you move past that part of it. And I encourage people to reach out for help. But the acknowledgement that sad things will always be sad. is a big part of grief.
Yeah. It reminds me of the whole piece of sadness. It reminds me of Inside Out when you talk
Yeah.
about how culturally we've gotten better. And hopefully we are, or at least making progress, maybe not getting better, but conversation is more prevalent than it used to be. And Brittany and I were doing some parent therapy, some counseling to help with our kids because in one of the situations, one of the pieces of encouragement for our kind of how we can help coach our children is to help our child get to the sadness sooner,
Mhm.
basically, like to help them recognize that it's actually, you're not mad about this. Mad is the easy feeling that feels more comfortable, especially for boys. What's actually going on is sadness. And so
Mm.
like the help to help this child progress in their emotional awareness is to help them feel sad, not just to get them to acknowledge anger, which is another grief stage, by the way. Um, so just I thought it was just kind of interesting when you're bringing up sad things will always be sad to notice too, like at least for me, it's easier to be annoyed than it is to be sad. It feels safer to be mad about something or to be that just to have, it feels so vulnerable to have to admit disappointment or loss or sadness, right? That feels like a really tough emotion to say out loud. It doesn't feel culturally acceptable often. It feels like, at least as a man, um, you're supposed to be able to move through that, right? Basically, or to like be strong, basically. And so, and I'm not saying that's reality. I'm just saying that's sometimes the messaging that you can hear. And so I think I really appreciate what you're speaking to. And I think part of hopefully we can continue to reward societally people for expressing sorrow and
Mm.
sadness as a critical component of the human experience and one that we all feel or we all experience, whether we allow ourselves to feel it or not. We certainly have all been disappointed by life. And I think the more we can feel those feelings and acknowledge them out loud without embarrassment or shame or um, associating a should that if I were, I don't know, Sarah mentioned this too in her talk, pain is real. Just because something is painful doesn't mean something's wrong, right? You can feel
Yeah.
like just because you're sad doesn't mean you made a mistake. Or right, that's that like spiral of like what a waste. I shouldn't have even loved. I shouldn't have even taken that job. I shouldn't have even married. I shouldn't have, whatever the should
Hmm.
get going. Um, so like the more we can just acknowledge sorrow without feeling like we're terrible people because we're feeling sad,
Yeah.
um, I think it'll be progress. I think I have to grow on that.
It's really helpful. But
Yeah.
mm, it's not wrong. We didn't make,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we make mistakes, but
Yeah.
the something ending is a natural part of human existence. Um, it's the flow of life in everything is there's a beginning and there's an end.
Yeah.
So accepting that and seeing it as all part of our story um, is helpful.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how some of the things um, we we kind of reviewed some of the rituals like um, surrounding grief. You and I've talked about,
Hmm.
and I talked about some of them in the message that I did on grief, and I still think they're really interesting to
Yeah.
discuss and kind of speak to what you were just talking about in terms of shame and allowing people to feel sorrow and not being uncomfortable in that.
Hmm.
And I will always think about the this night when I was in Malawi in East Africa, and we were staying at this place, and next to it was just a village, of people living their life. And I was walking back to my cabin with some of my Malawian friends, and there was all of a sudden this like noise that erupted, and it was dark. There was no lights, and it was dark, and it was all of this kind of like screaming and wailing and just loud human voices making these
Mm.
very strange sounds. And I was caught off guard by it. And I was like, um, what, what is
What is
that?
that?
And I remember my friend explaining that someone had died in the village next door, and that there was a tradition where at night all of the women in the village would make these wailing sounds, these screaming sounds, so that the family that lost someone could cry in peace and not be heard or be ashamed for the sounds that they were
Yeah.
making. Um, I'll never forget that moment. Just the idea of like our village helping us grieve
Yeah.
and creating space for that family to experience the emotions that go along with it. Um, I don't know that we can recreate that exact thing here,
No.
but the idea of allowance and giving space to
Hmm.
people who are in the midst of sorrow um, is something worth spending time on.
Yeah. I think that practice is beautiful. If you think about like what that, the beliefs of those people would be that grieving is not only like important or necessary, but it should be like we want to make it easy and natural for them to experience what they're going through. It reminds me of some of the grief series talking about how a common feeling or a common thing that people do when others are grieving is trying to fix it,
Mhm.
or they're and again we're uncomfortable with their loss, right? And so there, then I start saying things to like try to make myself feel less uncomfortable. The recommendation is to not fix, right? Just to be present, not to talk about what could have been or should have been, or right? Like there's so many great. If you're, I think actually the recommendation, if you have somebody who is grieving, please go listen to those. Talk to like how to help and how to not help. But I love that practice as an example of something that isn't fixing,
Mhm.
right? That's a great example of not fixing somebody who's grieving, not telling somebody to move through it quicker, not telling them that whatever future thing will be better or could have been better, and then just allowing them to experience their loss.
Yeah.
That's like the definition of empathy, right? Right? Like I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna go through what you're going through with you, right?
Mm. Yeah. The other one that I remember reading from David Kessler, I think, um, if you don't know Kessler, he was like a phenom researcher on grief and wrote some really powerful books kind of explaining it. One of the first ones to, I think he was the one that did the stages of grief. Um,
Mm.
but he talks about in one of his books about when someone dies, a practice of moving things around in your house or in a room. Just the acknowledgement that in your physical world that something has changed and won't ever be the same. And I actually thought about that this morning as I was coming in to record with you into my office. I was like, ooh, I've done so much EastLake work in this space.
Yeah.
And I was like, I think I might need to move it around.
Yeah.
I think I might need like a new desk and move things around to acknowledge that like I spent so much time in this space working on this thing that I love. And maybe I need to mark that change somehow in my physical world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think that moving things around and acknowledging it, right? Acknowledging that things are different is more helpful than pretending that nothing's changed, right? I just think that's so fascinating that in some ways, like making it more obvious that everything has changed helps.
I
Um,
think that speaks to also one of the things I talked about was there's a really strange thing that happens when you experience something traumatic or something like the loss of a person and everything else in the world seems to stay the same. It's one of the weirdest, most disorienting parts of like you're sitting You might even be in the room when someone leaves this earth. And yet you look outside and someone's driving to the grocery store and school buses
Yeah.
are driving by, and it's an awful feeling of like, what do you mean the world keeps going? My world has just ended, it feels like. Um, and so I think there is this element of like needing to acknowledge that things will never be the same. Things will never
Yeah.
be as they just were yesterday.
Yeah.
And even though that's true, you know, no matter your loss,
Right.
there's something to acknowledging that and doing something about it so that you can acknowledge that feeling that you have of the drastic change that happened inside of you and making it a reality outside of you too.
Yeah. It's interesting you bringing that up reminds in a small way. I think it's much smaller, but as we wrap EastLake, it reminds me like even communicating publicly, sending messages to people, calling people, and sending emails to different former staff and people who've obviously been around EastLake forever. Um, it has been in some ways a reminder that like, oh, EastLake ended for you a long time ago. It's
Yeah.
ending for us now, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like the revolving door concept that you've spoken to, like people transitioned out of EastLake being a critical piece of the pie, and it's still been pretty important to us and a handful of people and still a group of people that are now kind of fully grieving. I think the wrap, but a lot of people already went through that phase. So it's just
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. Like the world has gone on without Eastlake meeting at Juanita. The
Yeah.
world has gone on without campuses and drinks for drinks and all the things that are in Eastlake's history. The world keeps moving. And I think that's partly some of the challenge of the grief is to recognize like that was what was central to my world has shifted, not central to
Mm-hmm.
everybody else. And it's like this acknowledgement that something important to me was lost. Um, and it's important to say it out loud.
Mm-hmm. And
Sasha brought up
also,
another. Oh, go ahead.
and also, we have also received messages from people that have said, Eastlake feels like it ended for me a long time ago. And yet, hearing from you guys about the official ending brings up
Yeah.
feelings for me. We've
Yeah.
gotten those messages too.
Yeah.
Um,
For sure. Both. You're right.
that um, the official ending of something can bring up things that maybe you thought you processed already. You
Yeah.
thought you pre-grieved.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I've moved on. Oh, I haven't. I haven't fully moved
Mhm.
on. Right. Yeah. Some of the other rituals Sasha brought up that I was reminded that just different cultures have when it comes to loss. She brought up some of the early ones, like the example of mummification,
Mhm.
and even cultures that would like have a body that was wrapped like in kind of like this mummy state publicly as this kind of
Yeah.
like we want to slow down the process of feeling like they're gone.
Yeah.
And the idea of like helping them be around a little bit longer in the day to day, I thought that was interesting. She brought up um, oh yeah, she said that's an example of a physical incarnation of denial, right? It's like this really great example of stage one, right? Like that they're not gone yet. She mentioned pouring one out, the idea of pouring out a drink
Mhm.
for a loved one, and how that isn't just an example that comes up in rap songs or whatever, but that it's actually an ancient tradition found in Rome and Africa and Greece. This idea of like, right, us friends are gonna have a drink and we're gonna pour a drink out for the friend that should be here or the family member that should be here. She also mentioned an example from Bulgaria where when you've lost a loved one, you put a poster up, like a picture of that person, like prominently displayed outside your house with some like qualities and like information about them, and then you put that same poster up every year like as a marker, like an anniversary of their life. And I was even thinking about just having a picture of loved ones that maybe aren't with us anymore in your home as just a really like important significant way to acknowledge that they're not here anymore, but they're still a part of my life and still a part of that. I thought that was a beautiful like public way of acknowledging that.
Mhm.
And I don't feel like like you said, I think we're making progress, but that isn't, I don't feel like there's a ton of American traditions that like make it normal and like prominently display a loved one that we don't have or a loss, right? It feels like that's something, maybe that's just my experience, but it feels like those are some beautiful examples and ways that we could maybe grow, make that a little bit more prominent.
Yeah, I think there's a need to say this was real,
Hmm.
even if now it's only a memory. And finding ways to do that is part of grief. And there's a variety of things that I think you have to do what is meaningful for you. I mean, I have jewelry, I have a tattoo, I have pictures. I've done things to try to remind myself that that was real. Um,
Hmm.
there's a one of my favorite books about grief was C.S. Lewis, his book A Grief Observed. Um, it's very raw, and I appreciate his it was kind of his journaling about his wife dying. And I don't know the exact line, and I couldn't find the book because I know I underlined it. And my book, I think I read that probably 5 times. It's just
Yeah.
worn out. But he writes that someone basically said to him something along the lines of like, "She will always be with you." And his response to that was, "No, that's precisely the problem. She will not be."
Yeah.
And that's what I'm sitting in, essentially, was
Yeah.
um, trying to mark this reality that something was here and now it's gone.
Yeah. Yeah, that was discussed in the series too. One of my favorite concepts, going through the stages, right? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression. The last one, acceptance. Acceptance isn't, I've accepted that, I am accepting that I've lost this, right? Acceptance is more, I can now function despite my loss. And they brought up the idea of metabolization as like the best metaphor. So we
Yeah.
metabolize food, right? So when you metabolize loss, you've ingested it, you've broken it down, you've allowed it to become a part of you, basically. So instead of, I love that as basically like the definition of acceptance is you've metabolized your loss, you've like
Yeah.
received it
Integrated
inside
it.
of you,
It's like an
you've
integration.
integrated it. Yeah. And it's not like, even going back to that C.S. Lewis thing, you've, you have allowed the loss to become a part of you, right? So like maybe, his wife will never be with him, but he's now able to continue to move forward with that embrace of she's not going to be here anymore, which feels like it takes so much work and would like ebb and flow, right? I think you're never going to live in that stage all the time, but I thought the idea of metabolization was kind of helpful.
Yeah. I think the highlight is just it's I've said it I think 3 times already. It's just part of the human experience.
Yeah.
And as you grow older, as you age and experience life, you're going to love more things
Yeah.
and you're going to lose more things. It's just part of it. And so acknowledging that and learning how to live with that is something we all have to do. I think it's important for us to, as part of this, to specifically talk about Eastlake for you
Yeah.
and I. This is going to be the portion of the talk where Peter and I do therapy.
Totally. Right.
Yeah. Um, but maybe our therapy will help other people process theirs with whatever they're losing in their life. But I guess I wanted to ask you, like, it's an important part of this process for us to talk about what we're losing.
Hmm.
And I want you to go first.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been a couple years of losing. It feels
Yeah.
like being at Eastlake ever since 2014.
14.
has felt like just a decade of losing things, right? So losing my worldview, losing stability, losing. So I feel like EastLake's trained me to lose, is all I'm saying. Trained me to lose a lot of things, which I feel like I'm thankful for that. I think the official end to Eastlake brings up a lot of feelings of, can bring up feelings of failure. It can create some of that coulda, shoulda stuff. Um, I feel in terms of the things that probably matter the most, though, Eastlake brought so much joy and meaning and community. Um, like being on staff at Eastlake and being like around the core of the people was this really energizing, beautiful, like inspirational experience for the last decade of my life. And it wasn't that, like, it was a rhythm that was built into my weekly experience, almost daily experience of inspiration to live beautifully, inspiration to live selflessly, to try to become a better person, to try to grow and to be more loving and to be more vulnerable and more open-hearted. And now that I'm out of that environment, I realize how uncommon that is and how like that's no longer in my no longer in my algorithm, right? That isn't showing up for me, and so now I'm like, oh, I have, if I want to live that way, I have to do, like, it was in this stream that I was being sent down on, and I got to like ride the wave of that, and I feel like some grief that I don't know, I feel some grief that maybe that will go away because I don't have that community holding my hand, pushing me down that path. Um, Eastlake created a lot of meaning for me, meaning I felt like I was doing good in the world because I was a part of Eastlake.
Mhm.
And now I'm recognizing that I probably gave myself too much credit for like that being essential to who I am. I was just like kind of, yay, I'm a part of this, so I'm part of something bigger than myself, helping out the world. And now I feel like if I really want to say I live that way, I have to go do that and not just um, give myself credit for things that I used to be a part of in the past. Um, but I think the top of the pyramid for me was just, I think this has been, I've grieved some of this already, was just the loss of my identity. Like I have more, meaning the loss of my identity as a pastor, as a Christian, as all of those things that felt like identity markers. I've grieved that in already. I think that was something that Eastlake kind of facilitated, helped me walk through the loss of those things. And now not having that, I'm like, ooh, I hope I don't, I hope I don't go through anything too big because I needed that community to go through like the biggest thing of my life. And so now I'm like, who's gonna be there if I go through big shit? Because I'm gonna go through stuff. Come on, like there's gonna
Mhm.
be future shifts, loss, pain, and I think there's maybe anxiety that I won't be as like supported now that I don't have that.
Yeah.
Those are some thoughts. What comes up for you?
Mhm. All the things you said. Um, I'm not sure I've done a lot of like grieving Eastlake yet. Um, because I've still really tried to be in it
Hmm.
and be present in the specific, chapter that we're in. There's been sad things along the way and hard things along the way. And there's been chapters of Eastlake that have ended before up to
Yeah.
this point. So maybe it did grieve some of those, but I don't think they were ever really um I'm a symbolic person. I feel like that's and I feel like as long as Eastlake has still been in existence, I haven't really like mm, grieved what it's been before.
Yeah.
So as we've kind of processed together over the last few months, the reality of it ending, I feel like I'm trying to pre-grieve.
Yeah, totally.
I think it's easy. There's a lot of work to close down something like this. I mean, you and I have been busier and have had more meetings than we've had in years
Mm-hmm.
doing this part of it, which was surprising to me. Um, I feel like I'm grieving the loss of a role that I have played, um, that has been really meaningful to me. Um, being part of a team, even though the team has changed, I've been part of a team. Even just like you and me now,
Yeah.
it feels like um, it feels like a loss for sure. To lose part of just being a part of something. Um, I think I'm grieving, or I will be grieving, just a loss of purpose. I've had something to think about and be about and throw myself into. And that's a really great feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Even like the early years, the momentum and being part of something that felt really exciting and purposeful. And even the like shattering losses of, you know, those chapters of EastLake that were really hard still felt purposeful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, maybe even more important than the highs that we
Yeah,
experienced
in
through.
retrospect, right? Like
Yeah.
those were way more important. Yeah.
Um, I have had, like you said, Christianity brought so much meaning, and I think EastLake brought a lot of meaning into my life. And I still have lots of things that are meaningful and will bring meaning into my life, but there's no denying that when this finally ends, there will be um, a a hole. There will be a part of me that um, just at that moment, who knows when the last email is, when we shut that down. I don't know what that moment is, but I'm
Yeah.
expecting that there's going to be a moment where I feel it like it's over. Um, I was sharing with you, I turn on whatever movies are on. We still have cable. And I just like, at the end of the day, turning on movies that I've seen before, just to have in the background. And just a little while ago, Sleepless in Seattle was on, and I've barely ever watched that movie from the beginning. But Tom Hanks, his wife dies, and then his son calls this radio station, and she asks him about his grief, and he says, she says, "How are you going to keep going?" And he's like, "Well, I'm going to get up and breathe every day," and kind of goes through it. And then he says this line where he says, "And I'll remember how I had it great for a while."
Mm.
And I think about that with EastLake, looking back and being like, man, we had it great. I had it great for a while. And I think the better something is, the harder it is to let go. And this
Mm-hmm.
feels really hard because it was so great.
Yeah. I think that's a great sentence that kind of defines grief, right? Like acknowledging that it was great
Yeah.
is acknowledging that it's less great now,
Yeah.
um, or at least different. I think as you're sharing it reminded me too, like I'm definitely pre-grieving because we're still working on this, and even this is a recording to help us, like, shift into the next chapter. We're going to do more talks where we focus on all the things we're grateful for. But I feel like there's going to be different moments over the next year or two where I experience something and I miss that I don't have EastLake in my life. And I don't know when that will be, but like talking to my kids will trigger that. When we talk about God, faith, spirituality, the universe, how the heck we got here, um, it'll remind me like, oh, I wish like if EastLake were around, we might be having more of these conversations.
Hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see which, I'll have to text you which ones come up. It's like, damn it, EastLake were around, that'd be really freaking nice right now.
We're going to continue our weekly Zoom calls, right?
Yeah, exactly. Totally. I actually probably really benefit from that. But the sense of purpose though and camaraderie, um, we can still work towards. But yeah,
The vessel is
yeah,
that vessel is gone. Yeah.
the rhythm, the excuse,
Hmm.
the intrinsic. I'm doing something that's I mean, Kent talked about this in the first rituals talk, right? The idea that we need ritual. I was like, why do we even need them? We need them. Like humans need to feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. Like going to a Seahawks game, going to a concert, going to a wedding, going to a graduation. It's like this feeling of we're a part of something that's bigger. And Eastlake, like that is critical to like human flourishing. Like all humans need that. Like we lose. That's when you speak to sense of purpose, right? Like if we don't have that, we're a part of something bigger than ourselves. It is a essentially it's a harder way to live. It's harder to feel meaning and purpose and joy. Um, and Eastlake's been that greater, not just connected to like a small community in Bothell. It's like connected to the whole world, right? I'm connected to all of humanity, all of the biosphere, right? So I think losing that rhythm, I'll have to find another way. I have to replace that in order to thrive. And I think the inspiration is replaceable, right? Like I still find things that I can be inspired by. Um, but I don't know. Maybe I call take backs on that because there's some content out there that's just like really discouraging. I didn't
Doesn't
feel
fit.
regularly discouraged, you know? So I think I don't know, being in a community where you thought you could make a difference, you felt like hope and purpose, like this fostered the sense of hope that we're all, even if it's 100 of us, we're trying to live as a beneficial
Yeah.
presence in the world. Like that's really helpful on dark days when you're like in the world and you feel like, is there anybody who's even trying to do anything other than like what's most selfish? Like it's helpful to have 100 people saying, "Yep, I'm trying to live as a beneficial presence in the world," and so I'm gonna need that still, you know.
Yeah. I think that's a reason why there's grief, because I still need it.
Yeah,
So I still love it. I still find value. It's all those things, that's why it's hard.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I think all of these are important parts of just processing a loss, which is what we're doing.
yeah.
Um, yeah. I have one more thing I want to share, another poem, but did you have
Oh,
anything else you wanted to?
I do too. Well, let's end on your poem, but I just wanted to
Okay.
share this one quote from that Sarah shared in hers, because I loved it, and it was from someone that she referenced. I don't even know who specifically. Um, Frances Weller. That's it. A quote from Frances Weller. She says, "Grief is not an event in our life, but an ongoing conversation. I invite you to take up an apprenticeship with sorrow." This idea of, I love that quote for
Oh,
some reason. It messed with me. But just this idea of like to be fully alive, to be a full human requires like accepting sorrow. It's going to be a part of our life. And if you think about the idea of apprenticeship, like letting it be our teacher,
mhm.
um, and just like expect it, to expect that grief is a part of our life in a lot of different arenas, and that um, I need to let it be my mentor. It's just a beautiful idea.
Yeah. It's a teacher, whether you want it to
Yeah.
be or not. So
Yeah.
accepting that is a good idea. Okay. Maybe we could just end with this.
Perfect.
This is a poem by someone that I've recently started to follow. Her name's Emery Hall. And this is called Come Sit by My Garden. Let my gardens speak for me when I am gone. Let them speak in colored whispers of all the beauty I have seen and felt and lived. Let them speak of how much death had to find me, how many hard seasons it took to make me a living, breathing thing. Let them speak of my seasons of growth and abundance, but let them also tell of my seasons of loss and decay. Let the soft, wet earth be a reminder of hardness that didn't win, of sadness that didn't calcify, of surrender that triumphed over resistance. And let the glorious, fragrant blooms speak of my life and its greatest lesson, that the beauty we make never dies.
Thank you for joining us. To make a donation, head to eastlakecc.com/donate.